The city was never silent. Even in the still hours of the night it breathed, through the flickering neon signs, the distant rumble of a subway, the occasional honk of an impatient driver. It was a place of endless movement, a living, breathing entity that never truly rested. To some, the city was a symbol of opportunity. Bright lights, high-rise apartments, bustling cafes where people laughed over steaming cups of coffee. It was a place where dreams were built, where ambition thrived. But for others, the city was nothing more than a maze of cold streets and empty promises. Behind the glass towers and designer storefronts, there were alleys where people disappeared, doorways where the forgotten curled up for the night, hoping to make it to morning. Michael had walked these streets for years. He had seen both sides of the city, the wealth and the struggle, the triumphs and the tragedies. As a K-9 officer, his job was to keep the peace, but sometimes that meant acknowledging just how many people had already been left behind. His partner, Valor, shifted slightly in the passenger seat of the patrol car, ears perking at the distant sound of a siren. The German shepherd had been with him for nearly 4 years now, a loyal companion trained to sense danger before it struck. Valor wasn't just an officer's tool, he was a guardian, a protector. Together, they had chased down suspects, sniffed out missing persons, and stood between the innocent and those who sought to do harm. But the cases that lingered in Michael's mind weren't the high-speed chases or the drug busts. They were the ones that didn't make the news. The lost souls who had no one looking for them. The ones who had been abandoned long before the police ever got involved. Michael sighed, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel as he idled at a red light. The rain had started earlier that evening, slow and steady, misting the windows of the cruiser and softening the neon glow of the city. Somewhere out there, someone was running, hiding. Someone who had nowhere to go. Across town, in a forgotten corner of the city, 2 small figures huddled beneath the cover of an abandoned building. Daniel had stopped keeping track of the days. It had started with hope, his mother's voice echoing in his mind. "We'll be back soon. Stay strong for your sister." He had believed it at first. He had stayed by the door, watching, waiting. But the days stretched on, the cold crept in, and their return never came. Now there was only survival. Lily shifted against him, her tiny body trembling. She was too young to understand what had happened, too young to realize that no one was coming. Daniel tightened his arms around her, trying to block out the damp chill of the night air. The city was too big, too loud, too indifferent. During the day, they moved from place to place, looking for food, for shelter, for anywhere they wouldn't be noticed. At night, they stayed in the shadows, avoiding the eyes of strangers who might mean harm. Daniel had learned quickly that adults were unpredictable. Some ignored them, some looked at them with pity. But pity wouldn't keep Lily warm. Pity wouldn't stop the hunger clawing at his stomach. His clothes were thin, too small now, sleeves barely reaching his wrists. Lily's coat was torn at the seams, her shoes had holes in the soles. They had once had a home, a bed, warm meals. Now their world was reduced to whatever scraps Daniel could find. He knew he had to be strong. For Lily. Because if he wasn't, who would be? Back in the patrol car, Michael pulled into a quieter part of the city. The rain had picked up, now a steady drizzle that coated the streets in a thin sheen of water. The sidewalks were mostly empty, save for a few late-night stragglers hurrying home under umbrellas. He had always wondered about the ones who didn't have a home to go to. Years ago, he had responded to a call about a child found sleeping behind a gas station. The boy had been barely 10, hungry, scared, unwilling to speak at first. Michael had stayed with him, sitting on the curb in silence, until finally, the boy had whispered the truth. He had been waiting for his mother to come back. She never had. Michael had done his job, gotten the boy to safety, handed him off to social services. But he had never forgotten that empty look in the child's eyes, that quiet resignation that only came from understanding. far too young that you had been left behind. Some cases stayed with you. Valor let out a quiet whine, shifting again. Michael glanced over. "What is it, boy?" The dog didn't answer, of course, but Michael had learned to trust his instincts. He reached for his radio, about to check in, when a call crackled through the speakers. "Unit 14, report of 2 juveniles spotted near the old Lennox building. No guardian present." Michael's grip on the radio tightened. "Another child waiting for someone who wasn't coming back?" "Copy that. En route." He flipped on his lights and pulled into the next turn, rain-slick roads stretching before him like a path toward something unknown. As the city loomed ahead, Michael knew one thing for sure. Somewhere out there, in the shadows of this restless city, 2 lives were hanging in the balance. And this time, he wouldn't just be a witness. This time, he was going to make sure they weren't forgotten. The rain had deepened, falling in steady sheets that drummed against the windshield as Michael pulled up near the old Lennox building. The city around him blurred under the downpour, streetlights casting distorted reflections onto the wet pavement. The abandoned structure loomed ahead, a relic of another era, its brick walls stained with time, its shattered windows empty and lifeless. Michael killed the engine and sat in silence for a moment, his grip tightening around the wheel. He had been in situations like this before. Late-night calls about children found in forgotten places, lost, scared, and clinging to what little they had left. But something about this one felt different. Beside him, Valor shifted, ears pricked forward. The German shepherd was more than just a partner. He was a force of nature, trained to read fear and danger before they even surfaced. And right now, Valor was on high alert. Michael unfastened his seatbelt, grabbing his flashlight. The metal door of the building stood slightly ajar, creaking softly as the wind pushed against it. He stepped out of the car, the cold rain immediately seeping through the thin fabric of his uniform. "This is Officer Michael Reeves," he said into his radio. "I'm on scene. No visible threats. Proceeding inside." A static-filled response came through. "Copy that, Unit 14. Keep us updated." Michael exhaled, scanning the entrance. "Let's go, buddy," he murmured, and Valor moved beside him, steady and alert. Inside, the air was thick with dampness and decay. The remnants of old wooden crates were scattered across the cracked concrete floor, and somewhere in the distance, water dripped from a broken pipe. It was the kind of place no one came back for, the kind of place people disappeared in. Michael moved carefully, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He had learned after years on the job that silence told its own story. The absence of movement, the lack of any immediate response, it meant one of 2 things. Either the children were hiding, or they were too weak to run. Then he heard it, a whisper of movement. Barely there, but enough. He turned his light toward the farthest corner of the room. 2 small figures huddled against the wall, half hidden behind an old wooden pallet. The older one, a boy, no older than 10, curled protectively around a much smaller child. Michael immediately lowered his flashlight so it wouldn't blind them. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice calm. "It's okay. I'm here to help." The boy didn't move. His arms remained tight around the little girl, his entire body tense. Michael had seen this reaction before. He knew the look in the boy's eyes. Mistrust, fear, and something deeper. Something that said he had already learned that adults could not always be trusted. Michael didn't take another step. He knew better than to rush this. "I'm Michael," he said, "and this is Valor." At the sound of his name, Valor sat down beside Michael, ears relaxed, tail still. His presence was deliberate, calm, non-threatening. The boy's eyes flickered toward the dog, cautious but intrigued. "He's a good boy," Michael continued. "He's trained to help people. And right now, we're here to help you." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of rain hammering against the broken windows. Michael studied them carefully. The boy, Daniel, if the report was correct, was too thin, his clothes soaked through, his shoes worn down to nearly nothing. His small hands clenched tightly around the fabric of his sister's jacket, as if he could shield her from everything just by holding on tight enough. And the girl, Lily, was even smaller. Curled into her brother's side, her eyes barely open, exhaustion pulling her down like a weight she couldn't fight off. Michael felt something tighten in his chest. He had seen hunger before. He had seen neglect, but he had never gotten used to the way it looked on children. "I know you're scared," he said gently, "but you don't have to be out here alone anymore." The boy still didn't speak. His body remained locked in place, shoulders hunched, eyes dark with hesitation. Valor, sensing the boy's unease, slowly moved closer, just enough for Lily to notice. The little girl stirred, her tiny fingers twitching against Daniel's sleeve. For a moment, she simply watched the dog, her gaze unfocused. Then, weakly, she reached out. Valor remained still, letting her fingertips brush against his fur. It was barely a touch, just the faintest movement. But it was enough. Daniel's shoulders tensed at first. Then, as if some invisible barrier cracked, he exhaled a slow, shaky breath. Michael took that as his opening. "You're cold," he said. "I have a warm car right outside, and some blankets. We don't have to go anywhere you don't want to, but let's get Lily somewhere safe first, okay?" Daniel didn't answer, but Michael saw it. The tiny flicker of indecision. The part of him that was tired. That wanted to believe. He reached for his raincoat, holding it out. "Here, just until we get somewhere warm." Daniel hesitated, then, slowly, took it. He wrapped it around Lily first, pulling it tight over her small frame. Michael nodded. "That's a good big brother." Another moment passed. Then, finally, Daniel gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Michael moved carefully, standing up but not rushing. "All right," he said. "Let's get out of here." Valor led the way, moving just ahead but never too far. Daniel kept close to the wall, still holding Lily, his grip never loosening. The cold air hit them as they stepped outside, the rain still falling in steady waves. Michael opened the car door. "You can sit in the back. I'll turn the heater on." Daniel hesitated again, glancing up at Michael as if searching for something. Michael met his gaze. "I won't leave you," he said simply. A long pause. Then, finally, Daniel climbed inside, still holding Lily close. Michael wrapped a blanket around them, turned on the heat, and let the silence settle. Daniel adjusted the fabric around his sister, making sure she was warm. His hands still shook, but his shoulders weren't as rigid anymore. Michael picked up his radio. "This is Officer Reeves. I have the 2 juveniles. They're safe." Safe. But as he looked at the fragile children in his back seat, he knew this wasn't over, not even close. The warmth of the patrol car's heater filled the space, chasing away the lingering chill that clung to Daniel and Lily's soaked clothes. The soft hum of the engine blended with the rhythmic patter of rain against the windows. The moment should have felt safe, secure, but it didn't. Not yet. Michael kept his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He didn't turn around, didn't ask 1,000 questions right away. He had learned long ago that pushing too hard could send someone running, even if they had nowhere left to go. In the back seat, Daniel sat stiffly, his arms still wrapped protectively around Lily. His fingers gripped the edges of the raincoat Michael had given him, clutching the fabric like it was the only thing keeping him tethered. Lily, in contrast, had succumbed to exhaustion, her tiny body curled against Daniel's, her breathing slow but steady. Michael glanced briefly at them through the rearview mirror. He saw how Daniel's eyes flicked toward the door, scanning, assessing. He wasn't relaxing. He was waiting. For what? For Michael to turn on them? For someone to separate him from his sister? For this moment of safety to be nothing more than an illusion? Michael exhaled softly. He knew that kind of fear. He had seen it before, in kids who had learned, far too young, that trust could be dangerous. Beside Daniel, Valor lay motionless, his head resting between his paws, but his golden eyes were fixed on the boy, watching, not as a threat, but as a presence, solid, steady, unwavering. Minutes passed. Then finally Daniel spoke. "You're really a cop?" His voice was rough, hoarse from either the cold or from too much time spent in silence. Michael nodded, keeping his focus on the road. "Yeah, I am." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then his voice was sharper this time. "I don't trust cops." Michael didn't take offense. He had heard those words before. "I get that," he said simply. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly in the fabric of his coat. "They don't help people like us." Michael let that statement settle in the air, the weight of it. "Sometimes they don't," he admitted. "Sometimes they should, but they don't. And sometimes they try, but it's not enough." Daniel looked away, his jaw clenching. He didn't argue. Michael shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting his grip on the wheel. "You've been taking care of her for a while, haven't you?" Daniel didn't answer right away. Then, finally, a small nod. Michael tightened his jaw. "How long?" Daniel hesitated. Then, so quietly it was almost lost in the hum of the car, he whispered, "A few weeks." Michael felt something tighten in his chest. Weeks. He had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud made it real. He stole another glance at the boy. Daniel sat still, unmoving, his shoulders tense, his hands never straying from his sister. "You kept her safe this whole time." Daniel's response was immediate. "She's my sister. I had to." Michael exhaled slowly. There was no hesitation in those words, no uncertainty, just an unquestionable fact. This was his responsibility. Michael had seen men twice this boy's age buckle under pressure, had watched trained officers struggle to keep their composure in the face of crisis. But Daniel? He had survived. Michael tapped his fingers lightly against the steering wheel, his mind working through possibilities. "What about before that?" he asked carefully. Daniel's expression darkened. His fingers curled into a fist. "They said they'd come back." He let out a shaky breath. They didn't. Michael let that truth settle between them. He had seen a lot of terrible things in his career, but there was something about abandonment, about choosing to leave a child behind, that cut deeper than most. They drove in silence for a while, the city lights fading into the background as they neared the station. Michael knew the process. Fill out the reports, get social services involved. But the thought of dropping these two off at a shelter, of throwing them into a system that could separate them, that might fail them in ways even their parents hadn't, it didn't sit right. He glanced back at Daniel again. This boy, who had fought so hard to protect his sister, who had endured weeks on the streets, who had learned the hard way not to rely on anyone, how could he possibly trust that the system would do better? Michael sighed, pulling into the station lot. The building loomed ahead, fluorescent lights spilling onto the wet pavement. He shut off the engine. "We're going to go inside," he said, keeping his voice calm. "Just to get you guys warmed up. Get some food in you. That sound okay?" Daniel didn't respond immediately. His gaze flicked toward the station entrance, then back at Michael. Michael didn't push. "I'm not going to let anything bad happen to you, Daniel," he said quietly. "You don't have to believe me yet, but I need you to trust me just enough to walk inside." A long silence. Then, finally, Daniel gave a small, reluctant nod. Michael stepped out first, opening the back door. Valor hopped down, shaking off the rain. Daniel followed, still holding Lily. Inside the station, warmth wrapped around them. The air smelled of coffee and old paperwork, a stark contrast to the cold streets they had come from. Michael led them to a quieter area, one of the smaller side rooms away from the main office. It wasn't much. A couch against the wall, a vending machine humming softly in the corner, a stack of blankets folded neatly on a chair. He grabbed one and handed it to Daniel. "Here." Daniel took it hesitantly, sitting down slowly, adjusting Lily so that she remained curled against his chest. Michael went to the vending machine, buying a couple of protein bars and bottles of water. He set them on the small table beside the couch. "I know it's not much," he said, "but it'll help for now." Daniel stared at the food for a long moment before reaching for a bottle of water. He twisted the cap off, his hands trembling slightly. Michael sat across from them, resting his arms on his knees. For a while, no one spoke. Then Daniel asked, "What happens now?" Michael exhaled. "Normally, this is where I call social services." Immediately, Daniel's shoulders stiffened. His entire body went rigid, his arms tightening around Lily. Michael saw it. He saw the fear, the instinct to fight. "But," Michael added, "I don't think that's what you need right now." Daniel frowned, skeptical. Michael leaned forward slightly. "I don't have all the answers yet, kid. But I do know this. I'm not sending you and Lily back out there alone." Daniel searched his face, looking for any sign of dishonesty, any trace of an empty promise. He found none. He didn't believe Michael yet, not completely, but for the first time in weeks, he wanted to. And that was enough, for now. Michael sat at his desk, staring at the stack of paperwork in front of him. His pen rested idly against his knuckles, the usual routine of filling out forms and following procedures feeling heavier than usual. Down the hall, in a dimly lit break room, two children lay curled together on a worn-out couch. Even in sleep, Daniel's arms remained firmly wrapped around Lily, his body tense, as if he were afraid she would disappear the second he let go. Michael knew what he was supposed to do. The process was clear. Report the case, call Child Protective Services, and let the system take over. But the more he thought about it, the more that option felt wrong. He had seen too many cases like this before. Children shuffled from one place to another, separated from the only family they had left. Some ended up in good homes. Many didn't. And Daniel? Michael had no doubt that if someone tried to take Lily away from him, the boy would fight, and he would lose. Valor lay at his feet, silent and watchful. Michael reached down, scratching behind the German shepherd's ear. "What do you think, buddy?" he muttered. "Am I making a mistake?" Valor didn't respond, but Michael already knew the answer. There was really only one choice. The next morning, Daniel woke up before the sun had fully risen. He blinked groggily, the unfamiliar feeling of warmth and safety keeping him disoriented for a moment. Then, as if on instinct, he looked down. Lily was still there, safe. They hadn't been separated. Daniel let out a slow breath. But he didn't trust this place. Didn't trust Michael. Didn't trust anyone. The door creaked open slightly, and Daniel immediately tensed. Michael stepped inside, dressed casually in jeans and a jacket, without his uniform, without his badge, as if he had intentionally stripped away everything that made him an officer. "I was thinking," Michael said, "that we could get some breakfast." Daniel frowned. He knew where this was going. "What do you mean?" Michael sighed. "I made some calls last night. There are shelters, foster homes, places that could take you both in." Daniel's stomach clenched. He knew exactly what that meant. They would take Lily away from him. His jaw locked. "We're not going." Michael held up a hand, his voice calm. "I didn't say you had to." Daniel blinked, thrown off by the answer he hadn't expected. Michael crouched slightly, meeting his gaze. "I don't know what's going to happen next," he admitted. "But I do know this. I'm not going to leave you two alone." Daniel's heart pounded. Stay with him? Michael must have seen the doubt in his face because he added, I won't make you go anywhere you don't want to go, and I won't separate you from Lily. Daniel swallowed hard. And then what? Michael hesitated, then said, We'll take it one step at a time. A long silence stretched between them. Daniel wanted to say no, but when he looked at Lily, still asleep, still safe, he couldn't. He exhaled. Okay. The drive to Michael's apartment was quiet. As they stepped inside, Daniel's eyes darted around, scanning for any sign of a trap. Michael pretended not to notice. It's not much, he said, setting down a couple of bags. But it's yours for now. Lily yawned, rubbing her eyes as she stared up at the ceiling. It's warm, she mumbled. Daniel didn't respond. He just stood there, waiting for something to go wrong. Michael turned toward the kitchen. I'll make some breakfast. Daniel followed him cautiously, watching as Michael fumbled with the pancake mix. You don't know how to cook, do you? Daniel muttered. Michael shot him a mock-offended look. Excuse me, I'm a professional chef. Lily giggled, and for the first time, the tension in the room eased. Michael met Daniel's gaze. You okay? Daniel hesitated. Then, softly, he asked, Why are you doing this? Michael thought for a moment. Then finally he said, Because someone should. Daniel didn't respond. But maybe, just maybe, he wanted to believe him. The apartment was still. The kind of stillness that wasn't entirely peaceful, but rather uncertain, like a house that wasn't sure if it was meant to be a home yet. Michael sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him, watching the soft morning light spill through the window. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the faint trace of rain still lingering from the night before. He had been up for hours, not because he had to be, but because his mind wouldn't let him sleep. He had brought 2 kids into his home, kids who didn't trust him, kids who had spent weeks, maybe months, learning that adults only made promises they didn't keep. Michael knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew he couldn't just drop them off somewhere and pretend like it wasn't his problem. From the couch, Valor lifted his head, ears twitching as the bedroom door creaked open. Daniel stepped out first, moving cautiously, his shoulders stiff, his eyes flicking around the apartment like he was checking for threats. Lily followed a few steps behind him, rubbing her eyes sleepily. Morning, Michael said, keeping his voice even, like he wasn't sure if they'd bolt if he spoke too loudly. Lily yawned and mumbled something that vaguely sounded like, morning. Daniel didn't answer. Michael didn't take it personally. I made breakfast, he said instead, nodding toward the kitchen counter. Nothing fancy, but it's warm. Daniel hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the plates, scrambled eggs, toast, and pancakes that were slightly misshapen but still edible. Michael had been up early, flipping through an old cookbook, trying to remember the last time he had cooked breakfast for anyone but himself. Lily wandered toward the table first, climbing onto one of the chairs with the kind of sleepy clumsiness only kids could manage. Valor padded over to sit beside her, his tail wagging slightly as he rested his head against her knee. Daniel, however, remained standing. Michael didn't push. He just sat down across from Lily, picking up his coffee. Eat as much as you want, he said simply. Lily hesitated for only a second before reaching for the fork. The first bite must have been okay because she immediately took another. Daniel finally moved, sitting down across from his sister. But he didn't eat right away. He watched Michael, studying him. Michael let him. After a long silence, Daniel finally asked, So, what happens now? Michael exhaled. That depends. On what? On you. Daniel frowned. Michael set his coffee down. I meant what I said last night. You're not going anywhere you don't want to go. If you want to stay here for a while, we'll figure it out. If you want me to help you find somewhere else, I'll do that too. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then finally he muttered, "You don't even know us." Michael met his gaze. "I know enough." Daniel scoffed. "Like what?" Michael leaned forward slightly. "I know that you took care of Lily when no one else would. I know that you would rather sleep in an abandoned building than risk being separated from her. I know that you don't trust me yet, and I don't blame you." Daniel looked away. His fingers gripped the edge of his plate. Michael kept his tone steady. "You don't have to trust me right now, but I need you to believe that I'm not going to hurt you, and I'm not going to hurt her." Daniel swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "You're just going to send us away eventually." Michael sighed. "No, kid, I'm not." Another silence stretched between them. Then Lily, her mouth still half full of pancake, mumbled, "Can we stay?" Daniel stiffened. Michael glanced at her. "Yeah," he said, "if that's what you want." Lily nodded, completely unaware of the tension hanging in the air between her brother and Michael. Daniel still looked skeptical. Michael didn't blame him. The next few days were an adjustment. Michael tried to keep things simple, small routines, nothing overwhelming. Lily adapted quickly. She followed Valor around the apartment, giggling whenever the dog nudged her with his nose. She colored pictures at the kitchen table, hummed to herself while she played with an old stuffed animal Michael had found in a storage box. Daniel, however, was different. He remained on edge, like he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. He never strayed too far from Lily, never let his guard down. Michael didn't push. He let Daniel have space, let him watch, let him wait. And slowly, little things started to change. Daniel stopped flinching every time the door opened. He started setting the table at dinner, even though no one asked him to. He sat on the couch instead of the floor. He let Michael get closer. Not much, but enough. One evening, Michael found him standing by the window, staring out at the street below. Michael leaned against the doorway. "Something on your mind?" Daniel didn't look at him. "Just thinking." Michael nodded. "Yeah?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then softly he said, "I don't know how to do this." Michael frowned. "Do what?" Daniel swallowed. "This. Being here. Being safe." Michael exhaled. He stepped forward. Not too close, but close enough. "You don't have to figure it all out today," he said. "Or tomorrow. Or the next day." Daniel clenched his fists. "But what if we mess it up?" Michael let out a small, almost amused breath. "Kid, I burn pancakes every morning. If anyone's messing this up, it's me." Daniel let out a breath that was almost, but not quite, a laugh. Michael crossed his arms. "We'll figure it out, one day at a time." Daniel didn't say anything, but after a long moment he nodded. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was something. That night, after putting Lily to bed, Daniel hovered in the hallway outside Michael's room. Michael noticed but didn't comment. He just waited. Finally, Daniel stepped inside, hesitating near the doorway. He shifted awkwardly. "Thanks for, you know." Michael nodded. "Yeah, I know." Daniel hesitated again. Then, after a long pause, he muttered, "Good night." Michael smiled slightly. "Good night, kid." As Daniel turned to leave, Michael heard him whisper something else, so soft he almost missed it. But he heard it, and it was enough. "Good night, Valor." From his spot by the bed, the German shepherd thumped his tail once in response. The late afternoon sun streamed through the blinds, casting golden streaks across the wooden floor. Dust particles floated lazily in the air, catching the light, creating a quiet glow that softened the edges of the small apartment. Michael sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of papers before him. The words printed on the documents were simple. Legal, procedural, just ink on paper. And yet, they carried the weight of something so much bigger, something irreversible. Across from him, Daniel sat stiffly, his arms crossed, shoulders drawn tight. His dark eyes flicked between the documents and Michael's face, suspicion etched into every inch of his expression. Michael knew this wouldn't be easy. He had spent weeks earning scraps of trust from this boy, and even now, with Daniel sitting in his apartment rather than out on the streets, that trust was still fragile. Still something that could be shattered with a single misstep. Lily, unaware of the gravity of the moment, was curled up on the couch with Valor, humming softly to herself as she lazily ran her fingers through the dog's thick fur. Unlike her brother, she had allowed herself to relax, to accept the warmth, the food, the safety. But Michael knew it wasn't her trust that needed to be won. It was Daniel's, and right now, he was losing the battle. Michael cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I wanted to talk to you about something important." Daniel's fingers twitched slightly, but he didn't speak. Michael pushed the stack of papers across the table. "These are adoption forms." Daniel's reaction was immediate. His entire body tensed, his hands clenching into fists. His breathing slowed, controlled, measured, but his eyes burned with something sharp and raw. Michael didn't back down. "It means that if you want, you and Lily can stay here for good. No more shelters, no more uncertainty, no more worrying about where you'll end up next." Silence. A long, heavy silence. Daniel didn't even look at the papers. His gaze stayed locked on Michael, as if waiting for the trick, the catch, the inevitable but that always seemed to come when people promised things they couldn't keep. Finally, his voice, low, almost hoarse, cut through the quiet. "Why?" Michael met his gaze. "Because family isn't just about where you're born. It's about the people who choose to stay, who don't leave." Daniel flinched, his jaw tightening. Michael knew that wound too well. Still, Daniel didn't look away. His voice, when he spoke again, was bitter. "People always leave." Michael felt the weight of those words, the way they weren't a question or even an accusation. Just a fact Daniel had learned the hard way. Michael leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. His voice was steady, calm. "I'm not leaving." Daniel let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Yeah, okay." Michael didn't react. He let the silence settle again, let the words sit between them, waiting. Daniel's fingers twitched toward the edge of the table, but he still didn't reach for the papers. "She doesn't even understand what this means," he muttered, glancing toward Lily. Michael nodded. "No, she doesn't, but you do." Daniel's jaw clenched so tightly that Michael could see the tension running through him. His entire body wound like a wire stretched too thin. Then, suddenly, he shoved his chair back, standing abruptly. "We don't belong here." Michael remained seated, watching as the boy turned away, breathing heavily. "Says who?" Michael asked quietly. Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. "Says the world." He gestured vaguely toward himself, toward Lily, toward everything. "We were sleeping in an abandoned building a few weeks ago. We were starving. We were invisible. Nobody cared. And now you're telling me we're just supposed to... what? Pretend we're normal?" Michael's chest tightened. He had no easy answer for that. Because Daniel was right. The world hadn't cared. Not until it was almost too late. Michael exhaled slowly. "You're not invisible anymore." Daniel froze. Michael pressed forward. "I see you. I see Lily. And I know you don't trust that yet. I don't expect you to. But I meant what I said. I'm not sending you away." Daniel turned slightly, not enough to meet his eyes, but enough that Michael could see the conflict in his face. He wanted to believe it, but wanting and allowing were two very different things. "I don't need your pity," Daniel muttered. Michael shook his head. "This isn't pity, kid. It's a choice." A thick silence followed. Daniel stared at the papers, his expression unreadable. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. And then, "Danny?" Lily's small voice broke through the tension like a thread of light through a storm. She had climbed off the couch and was now standing beside her brother, blinking sleepily. Daniel immediately turned toward her, all the sharp edges in his face softening in an instant. "Yeah?" She rubbed her eyes, then looked at the papers, at Michael, then back at Daniel. "Can we stay?" Daniel swallowed. Hard. Michael didn't say anything. This choice had to be Daniel's. A long, endless moment passed. Then finally, hesitantly, fearfully, Daniel reached out. His fingers brushed against the pen. He hesitated. And then with a deep, shaky breath, he signed. The moment was small, a simple movement, but it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. Michael let out a slow breath, not wanting to break the moment. Lily clapped her hands together. "Yay!" Valor let out a soft huff, his tail wagging. Michael looked at Daniel, who was staring at the paper like it might disappear if he blinked. "You okay?" Michael asked quietly. Daniel hesitated. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. A real nod. Not forced, not reluctant, just real. That night, Michael tucked Lily into bed, smoothing the blanket over her small frame. She smiled sleepily up at him. "Good night, Daddy." Michael froze. His chest clenched, but in the best way. He swallowed past the sudden lump in his throat. "Good night, sweetheart." She drifted off almost instantly, her breathing soft and steady. Michael turned off the light and stepped into the hallway. Daniel was there, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. Michael hesitated. "You heard that?" Daniel smirked slightly. "Yeah." Michael exhaled. "Didn't see that coming." Daniel didn't respond right away. Then, after a long pause, he muttered, "You meant it, right?" Michael met his gaze, no hesitation. "Yeah, kid." "I did." Daniel shifted. Then, just loud enough to hear, he whispered, "Good night, Dad." Michael's breath caught. For a second, he didn't move. Then, with a quiet, unwavering certainty, he said, "Good night, kiddo." And for the first time in a long time, Daniel let himself believe it. Some stories are not just about what happens. They are about the quiet, unseen moments that change the course of a life. The moments where a decision is made, a hand is extended, and a promise is kept. This heartwarming story isn't just about survival. It's about the power of choice, the meaning of belonging, and the quiet strength of love that isn't bound by blood. At its core, this story stands as proof of one simple truth. Family isn't about blood. It's about who stays. It's about the people who choose you, who stand beside you when no one else does, who refuse to turn away even when things get difficult. Michael never planned to be a father. He never imagined that one decision would change his life forever. He wasn't searching for a reason to alter his path, but sometimes the most important choices aren't the ones we plan. They're the ones we make when someone needs us the most. It wasn't obligation that made him open his home. It wasn't duty that made him stay. It was something deeper. It was the choice to be there, to stand by, to refuse to walk away. And in the end, that's what family is. It isn't defined by shared DNA or legal documents. It's built in moments of trust, in quiet reassurances, in the simple but powerful act of choosing to stay. For Daniel and Lily, home wasn't a house. It wasn't walls or furniture or a roof over their heads. Home was a person. It was Michael who refused to give up on them, who showed them day after day that love isn't something you earn. It's something given freely by those who truly care. For Michael, family wasn't something that happened by chance. It was something he built, piece by piece, with every promise he made and kept. He didn't step into their lives because he had to. He stayed because he wanted to. This story isn't just about three lives coming together. It's a reflection of something greater, the idea that small, selfless choices ripple outward, transforming lives in ways we may never fully see. The decision to care, to stay, to make space for someone who has been left behind, These are the choices that shape not only individuals, but entire communities. So, ask yourself, when was the last time you made a choice that truly mattered? Have you ever considered that one simple act of kindness, one moment of genuine care, could change the course of someone's life, or even an entire community? Because in the end, it's not about grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices. It's about the people who stay, the ones who choose love when they don't have to, the ones who stand firm when the world turns away, the ones who decide in the quiet, ordinary moments to make a difference. So, what choice will you make? Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.